What is going on, you guys? So, I've been doing a lot of work on my cooling system recently, and a lot of you might have seen I have these tanks back here. I have an expansion tank and an overflow recovery tank here. So, I figured I'd go into detail and explain to you guys exactly what those do and what the difference between an expansion, recovery, and an overflow tank are. So, let's jump into it. So to make things a little bit easier to understand, I drew up a diagram of the way the system is on my car. Now we have the radiator with the inlet and outlet, and then up here at the corner we have a port, and that's for expansion into the expansion tank. Now this right here, this is the expansion tank in my system. And you can see that it comes off the top of the radiator right here and goes up into the expansion tank. And then at the bottom of the expansion tank is a line that feeds back into the system down there. Now, what is the point of an expansion tank? Well, when you're running a vehicle and the vehicle gets hot, the coolant gets hot. And basically, when stuff heats up, the molecules start moving around really fast, and that creates expansion. And the expansion creates more pressure. So, when you build that pressure up, you kind of need somewhere for that pressure to go if it gets too high. Now, what an expansion tank does is it allows that pressure to overflow into this tank. Now what it's also really good for is if you ever get like air in the system or anything like that, that air will come up out of this system and go into the expansion tank, and then the coolant will settle down at the bottom and go back into the system, essentially helping to pull air out of the system. Now, say your system gets too high on pressure. A radiator cap will say what the pressure rating is on it. This one is 21 to 25 psi. Now what that means is at 21 to 25 psi, this spring will open up like that. Now when this spring opens up, what it'll do is allow coolant to overflow out into the recovery tank or the catch tank, whichever one you have. Now, what a catch tank does is it's exactly what it sounds like. It's a catch tank. It's there to catch the overflowed coolant that's coming out of the system from overpressurizing, if you were overheating or something like that. So what it'll do is, this is a recovery setup I have drawn right here, but a catch tank setup will basically go to the top and it'll just collect fluid into the tank with a drain on the bottom, and then you drain it occasionally, but you have to add coolant back into the system to compensate for what was pulled out. Now on a recovery tank system, this line off the top here will actually go to the bottom. And what that does is, as it's overpressurizing, say it's got air in the system or coolant or whatever, it's pushing air, coolant out, and that'll build into this tank. Now, when you shut the car off and the system starts cooling down, eventually everything wants to equalize. So as the system's cooling down, you had all that coolant that expanded in there, and it expanded so much it pushed some of the mass out of the system. Now, after it cools down, the cap shuts, but you have less mass that was in there before. So as that's cooling, it's going to contract. And when it starts contracting, when you reach a certain temperature, you're actually going to be having reduced pressure in the system. You've probably seen situations with a bad radiator cap where when the car cools down, radiator hose closes. Radiator hose will collapse in on itself, and that's usually due to a bad cap. Now, what a recovery system does, since it's at the bottom here, the recovery tank is vented to atmosphere. Now, atmospheric pressure at sea level is about 14.7 psi. So if the coolant system drops below that, what it'll do is you're going to have atmospheric pressure pushing down on this coolant inside here. And that force will open up this secondary valve in the radiator cap. Now, when that opens up, it pushes the coolant back into the system, recovering it. So that's why it's called a recovery tank. Now you have to make sure it's vented to atmosphere. That way you actually have a force pushing on the liquid to push it back into the system. And then once the system's equalized, the cap will shut and the coolant's back in your system. Now if you wanted to, you could run a recovery tank, and then on the outside of a recovery tank, run an overflow tank as well as a redundant backup for it. Usually there's no need to do it. A recovery tank works very well. They do have caps on the top usually. To drain them, there will usually be a drain at the bottom. Sometimes it's just the hose going into the bottom of it, but the hose going into the bottom is very important on the recovery tank setup. I'm going to give you guys a little walkthrough of the coolant system on my car and show you how I have it ran. Since I have a rear mount radiator with an electric water pump, I'm going to show you guys what I did on mine. So up here in the front of the vehicle, you see the tubes coming off of the water pump adapters. We have our return up top here and our feed at the bottom on these lines that I built right here. Now right here is the crossover port for steam release, and what that does is it's the highest point of water flow in the engine, so any air that gets trapped in the engine or anything like that will get pushed up out through that line. As the air builds up and comes out this line, it goes right into the return line right here. We'll go around back and I'll show you where that goes to. So that return line goes to this hose, which runs across and up into the top of the radiator. So any air that got in the system will go to the top of the radiator and then go into this tube, which goes into the expansion tank. Now, once all the air is out of the system, you bleed it and do all that. You know, you make sure it's all topped off. And, you know, it's good to have just in case any air is trapped in the system, you can still bleed it out. But it also leaves room for coolant expansion without overbuilding pressure in the system. And any coolant that flows into this goes right back down at the bottom like I showed you before. And the water pump is mounted right there. Now, let's say, for example, the vehicle gets hot and too hot and builds up too much pressure in the system. Well, then the cap is going to open up, and then coolant and air, well, air first, and then coolant, if need be, is going to come out of this line here, which I don't really have a hose on it right now, but it'll come out of there, and it's going to go down to the bottom of this tank right here. Essentially, you know, putting coolant into this system right here, you know, keep a little bit in it at all times, but since it's vented up top, when the vehicle cools down, that atmospheric pressure is going to be able to push the coolant back down into the system, essentially recovering it. And you might have noticed this little cap on here that was just put on there because redundant radiator caps are not a good thing to have in my personal experience, so I cut the old one off and just put a twist lock cap on it, just in case you were wondering what was going on there. But yeah, that's a quick explanation on expansion tanks, recovery tanks, overflows. You can see I got Canton Racing stuff for everything on my car. I use Canton Racing products for my cooling system, oiling system, AccuSumps, whatever you need. Canton Racing has a great selection of all that product, so go check them out if you're interested in any of that stuff. They've been a great supporter of mine over the years, and I love running their products, and I've never had any issues with them, so I highly recommend you guys check them out. Anyways, that's going to be it for this one. So subscribe to the channel if you're new and follow the build along. Like the video if you liked it. Hopefully you guys got a little bit of knowledge from it and it helped you out a little bit. So I'll catch you guys later.